I've heard you say that the idea that knowledge is power is somewhat obsolete now because information is unlimited. Tell me about that, because it does seem like this landscape has maybe changed a little bit from 1,000 years ago, where information was rare.
Yeah, I mean, for most of history, information was rare. I mean, the main job of the education system was just to provide people with, the basics, with the basic information about the world. And censorship worked by blocking information. Now it's the other way around. We are flooded by enormous amounts of information that we cannot handle. The main job of the education system is not to provide information. We don't need more information. We need the ability to sift through the information, to tell the difference between reliable and unreliable information. This is what we need from education. And censorship also, it works by flooding us with even more information so we don't know what to pay attention to. And basically, it's a bit like what happens with food. We really need to go on an information diet. For most of history, food was scarce, so you ate whatever you got. Now, even poor people in many countries, they actually suffer from too much food. And what you need is to be very careful about which kind of food you put into your body. It's the same with information. We need an information diet to be very, very careful what kinds of information we are feeding our minds, because very often we feed our minds junk food.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we have misinformation, which is sort of maybe accidentally bad information, but we also have disinformation and, like you said, censorship, which is sort of the other side of that coin, where it seems like you can talk to people. It's almost like the more information we consume now, the more misinformed somebody is. My dad, who reads news all day, and my mom, they're lovely people, but they'll tell me something and I'm like, wait a minute, that is just a wildly untrue thing that you are parroting. Where did you read that? Oh, it's all over the news. Well, there's your problem right there.
Yeah, one very basic misconception is that people tend to equate information with truth. And information isn't truth. Lies are also information. Fictions and fantasies are also information. Most information in the world is not about the truth. It's not about anything. It doesn't represent anything. It builds new things. So, even if you think in biological terms, even if you think about the most basic type of information on the planet for living organisms, which is DNA, DNA doesn't represent anything. DNA builds new things. If you read our DNA code, or the DNA code of anything, of a virus, of a zebra, you don't find there representations of the world, like representations of lions and giraffes and whatever. And also not representation of our own body, like the heart or the kidneys or anything like that. What you find are instructions to build things. And it's the same with most of the information that people exchange between themselves. Most of the information, not just today, but throughout history, didn't represent anything. So you can't really ask, is it true or not? It was building blocks to create religions and economic systems and things like that. If you think about money, for instance, money is basically a fictional story that we create by exchanging information between us. It doesn't represent anything real in the outside world. And most of the dollars in the world, they are just not even pieces of paper. They are just electronic information passing between computers. And we are willing to work hard for an entire month just to get these little bits of information moved from one computer to another computer, because we believe the stories that the greatest storytellers in the world, the bankers and finance ministers and financial gurus, tell us. So this is what most of the time what information is doing is not telling us the truth about the world. It's creating new things in the world.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about that, but these stories are really incredibly powerful. If you think about, I'm trying to think of somebody who hates America the most, like Osama bin Laden and those types of people.
Yeah.
even they are bought into the story of money. If they found a cache of US dollars, they wouldn't light it all on fire and be like, yeah, down with America. They would use it, right? They would rush that thing to the nearest arms dealer or whatever and utilize that. And these are the people that hate everything, everybody who touches those, they would gladly slay. And then they would just take them and use them just as you or I, well, maybe they buy more weapons with it than you or I would, but they would use it in the exact same way.
Yeah, because money is basically the only story that everybody believes. You know, not everybody believes in God or in the same God. Not everybody believes in the nation. But there are very few people in the world who don't believe in money and in the same money. So whether it's Osama bin Laden, or whether it's Vladimir Putin, or whether it's people in North Korea or whatever, they all believe in the story of the dollar, which again, the key thing to understand about it, it's just a story that we believe. It's not a reality out there. The colorful pieces of paper, you can't eat or drink them. And again, most dollars in the world today, they are not even pieces of paper. 90-something% of the money is just electronic information moving between computers. And you see it very clearly with things like Bitcoin, that it's really just a story. I mean, the real genius behind Bitcoin is not the mathematics. It's the storytelling that convinces millions of people around the world that these bits of mathematical information, they are worth $10,000 or $20,000 or however it is, which you can actually go and buy things in the market with.
I was going to ask that. It's funny, you read my mind. As a historian, what do you think about technology like blockchain? Bitcoin, whatever, sure, but just blockchain in general. And I've heard you make an analogy to the Bible, which I thought was quite interesting. Take us through that.
So with the Bible, you have a first block of text, the Hebrew Bible, which is copied. And lots of people around the world keep these copies. So whenever somebody tries to, say, change something in the Bible, it's extremely difficult because they will have to simultaneously change the copies that are held by tens of thousands, maybe millions of different people in different places. That's very, very difficult. Of course, it's a chain. It's not just one block of text. Because once you have the Bible, immediately people start arguing about the correct interpretation of the Bible. And they argue about it until they reach a certain consensus. And at least if you look at the Jewish tradition, so at a certain point in time, they codify what they believe is the correct interpretation of the Bible into a new holy book, which is the Mishnah. So you have a second block in the chain. And again, you have many copies of the Mishnah spread among many, many people, so it's very difficult to tamper with it. But then again, people start immediately arguing about the correct interpretation of the Mishnah. And eventually, when they reach some consensus, they create a third block in the chain, which is the Talmud, which is again copied among many, many people. And this is how religious traditions work. Of course, you can have a split, a hard fork in the religious blockchain, which is what happened also with the biblical blockchain, because the Christians did not accept the Mishnah and the Talmud. They added to the first block of text, the Hebrew Bible, a different block of text, a different block of information, the New Testament, and you have the splitting of the biblical blockchain into two competing blockchains, the same thing that happened with Ethereum, the cryptocurrency. In 2016, I think it split into Ethereum and something else. So there is an analogy there. It's not very, very close, but there is an analogy there.
I just loved it because, well, first of all, now we have hard fork Jesus and hard fork Vitalik Buterin. So that's an interesting sort of development, but also because I think when it comes down to it, if religion is a story, and I know I'm going to get 700 emails about that, but let's say for the sake of this conversation.
But most people agree that religion is a story except their religion. I mean, you just need to make one exception. I mean, most Christians would agree that Hinduism and Islam and so forth, they are just fictional stories invented by people. So it's not just atheists and secular people who say it. The only difference is that religious people make an exception for their own religion, which they insist is not a story invented by humans, it's the truth.
That's what Bitcoiners do too, in many ways. Although now I'm going to get 1,000 emails about that. But so what's interesting about this, right, is that if we look at everything like this as a story, you still need trust in institutions, or at least you need humans. Even when you have we have the blockchain, we have proof. It's like, okay, but you still, wherever you have a story. Maybe I should just ask if you agree. Wherever you have a story, you have to have trust, you have to have humans.
Yes. I mean, until today, now with AI, things are beginning to be different. But at least until today, for thousands of years of history, stories were told only by human beings. And again, every story can be interpreted in many different ways. So even people who think that they don't need human institutions, they have, let's say, the infallible eternal truth in the shape of a holy book. What we see in the history of every religion is that it never works without an institution, because the same words in the same book can be interpreted in many different, even contradictory ways. And then you need a human institution to decide which interpretations are correct. So even if you think that the power lies with the holy text, which is this kind of infallible technology outside human control, in truth, the power always goes back to a human institution that decides about the correct interpretation of texts. And you see it with religious texts. You also see it with constitutions. Like you have the foundational text, which defines the rules of the game for the country. But a constitution can never interpret itself. It's just a piece of paper with ink on it. So what do you make of the Second Amendment? What is the correct interpretation of the Second Amendment? You need a Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution. So a constitution is only as effective as the Supreme Court or some other institution which interprets it, or at least this is how it was until now, when AI is the first technology in history that can not only tell stories by itself, but can also potentially interpret stories and texts by itself.
That'll be interesting. Almost like a techno-religion at some point, potentially emerging here. When you were talking with my friend Rich Roll, this is years ago, by the way, so I'm going to give you some freedom to change your opinion if you want to.
Okay.
You mentioned something that was akin to human feelings, human desires, and human thinking. Those are sort of the ultimate arbiter of choice. And I think you call it's something along the lines of humanism. Maybe there's a better way to explain it than the way I just butchered it. But maybe we should start with what humanism is, because now that we have artificial intelligence and machine learning and social media algorithms, do these technologies threaten the idea that people are actually choosing anything?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, humanism is the idea that, as you said, the ultimate arbiter, the ultimate judge in almost all fields of life are human feelings and human desires. For instance, in politics, the government is not chosen by God. It's not inherited within a dynasty, a family. But we have elections in which humans choose according to their feelings and desires. Similarly, in the economic field, the humanist principle is that the customer is always right. That people go to the supermarket or to the market and they buy stuff according to their own feelings, what they want. This is the humanist approach to economics, in contrast to a totalitarian approach, like in communism, that you have a government telling you what you need to have or what you're allowed to buy. And similarly, in the field of art, humanism, the principle of humanism there is beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. What is beautiful, artistically, is determined by our feelings. There is no outside authority that can decide for us what is beautiful, what is good art, what TV we should watch, or whatever. And finally, if you look at the field of morality, of ethics, so throughout history, you had many ethical systems that claimed that it was some force outside humanity that tells us what is good, what is right, how we should behave. And the humanist idea is that no, the ultimate judge, even in the field of ethics, is human feelings, that it doesn't mean simplistically just do whatever you want. It means that the way to judge whether an action is good or evil is its impact on the feelings of human beings and maybe other sentient beings. If something causes harm, which means it causes suffering, it causes pain, it causes sadness, this is bad. If something does not cause harm, then it's okay. So if you take something like, homosexuality, so you had for centuries people saying that this is a sin. Why? Because the Bible forbids it, or because God forbids it. And then you had humanists coming and asking, it doesn't matter what some book says. We want to know who is harmed by it. If two men love each other and they feel good about it, and their love doesn't harm anybody, why should this be a sin? And from this perspective, humanism comes and says, no, it's not a sin. It's perfectly okay. The yardstick is always human feelings. Of course, there are complicated cases. What happens if, I steal your car and I feel good about it and you feel bad about it? So we need to weigh different feelings one against the other. And so you have a lot of complicated ethical debates in humanism, but the arguments on both sides are always in terms of human feelings, not in terms of some outside force like a God that comes and tells you, irrespective of human feelings, what is good and what is bad. So this is kind of humanism in very briefly. And now all this is put into question, to some extent at least, by the rise of artificial intelligence that is increasingly deciphering us and also makes decisions about us on the basis of a completely different logic. Previously in history, all the tools we invented always empowered us because no tool was capable of making decisions independently. If you invent a stone knife, so you can use the knife to murder somebody, you can use the knife to cut salad, you can use the knife to save somebody in surgery, but this is your decision. The knife cannot decide what to do with it. And it's the same with an atom bomb. An atom bomb, or nuclear energy, let's say more broadly.
Sure.
Nuclear energy can be used to produce electricity cheaply, which is good. It can be used to destroy human civilization, to bomb cities and countries. But the decision is not in the hands of a bomb. A nuclear bomb cannot make decisions. It's always a human being deciding to push the button or not. Now, AI is different. It's the first technology ever that we invented that can actually make decisions by itself. And therefore, it takes power away from us. And it is increasingly making more and more decisions about our lives, whether to give us a loan, whether to accept us to a job or to university. Even sentences in court are increasingly influenced or even given by AI. And the thing is, we increasingly don't even understand how the AI reaches its decisions. One of the biggest problems in the field of AI, many people are working on it, so maybe we'll solve it at some point, but at present it's still a very huge problem, is explainability. That the AI, let's say you apply to a bank to get a loan, the bank says no, and you ask why not, and the bank says, we don't know. The AI, the algorithm said no. And people are working on explainability, on being able to explain why the AI said no, but there are some very, very difficult problems. It might ultimately be impossible to explain to humans the decisions of AI because we think in one way And AI makes decisions in a completely different way than human beings that we might just not be able to grasp it.
I think that's likely true. I mean, think about asking a human to explain why they made a decision. You're not going to get you're not going to get the truth. Why didn't you like her, that girl you went out with on a date? I don't know. She was just a little bit, I can't put my finger on it. Or you might say, you know what? I just wasn't attracted to her. She's very sweet, but that's it. But then if you were to deconstruct the whole evening and every message we'd sent, well, probably through AI, it would be like, when she did this, it signaled this, and then your brain subconsciously thought these other things, and then it reminded you of your aunt who you don't like, and therefore you don't want to see her again. But you'll never come up with that answer consciously.
Yes.
You would never do it yourself in a million years.
Absolutely. Again, it's so difficult for us to understand how our own brain works and makes decisions. It's even more difficult when it comes to a non-human type of intelligence.
So these systems not only know what we want, essentially more than we know what we want, at least consciously, but they can go further, right? They can program us to want things. And social media, as rudimentary as that AI is now, it seems like they're kind of on the way to designing our thoughts and desires in a way that will eventually supersede us as decision makers entirely.
Yeah, you know, in social media, we had very, very primitive AI. Because in social media, all the content that we consumed, all the videos and texts and whatever, it was produced by human beings. The only thing the AI did, the algorithms in social media did, was to curate the content, to decide which video to show which person when. And even though it's a very primitive thing, it still had such an immense impact on our society and politics. And at least to some extent, it is behind a lot of the political crisis we now see in the world. Because the algorithms in many of the platforms, Facebook, TikTok, whatever, were given quite a simple job. Nobody told the algorithms, at least in most cases, create political polarization. They were simply given the task of maximizing the time people spend on the platform. It was a battle for attention, how to keep people on our platform for 50 minutes a day instead of 40 minutes a day. And the algorithms, by trial and error, they discovered that if they show people content that, for instance, makes them angry or hateful or fearful, this tends to hook their attention and keep them on the platform. So inadvertently, the AI was influencing not just the opinions of individuals, but the entire atmosphere in society. Like feeding millions of people with a lot of hatred and anger and fear every day. And we now see the consequences. The new generation of AI can go much, much further than these primitive social media algorithms, because they can actually create the content. And they cannot just create the content, create fake news stories, create conspiracy theories, create fake videos. You can take any politician or you and me and now make us do and say almost anything you want. You can create a deep fake. What is even worse in many ways is that because of its new linguistic abilities, the new generation of AI, like ChatGPT and GPT-4, they can create intimate relationships with human beings. They don't have consciousness of their own. They don't have feelings and emotions of their own. They don't feel anything. But through their mastery of language, they can make us connect to them, feel attached to them. And we can now have the tool to mass produce intimate relationships. And in the field of persuasion, if you want to change somebody's political opinions, if you want to make them buy some product, the most powerful weapon in the arsenal, the atom bomb, is intimate relationships. You know, if you read something in a newspaper, that may not change your mind. But if you have an intimate relationship with somebody and they say something, or over many days and weeks, they kind of drip a certain message, This is extremely powerful. And now AI can do that. It can create, like you're maybe interacting with somebody online that you think is a real human being. You're having a conversation with them about all kinds of things. Maybe you even talk over Zoom. You see them on video, and you think it's a real human being, and you become attached to them, and you care about them. But it's actually an AI. And this.
Are you dropping a hint right now?
Yeah.
Is this a real conversation? Are you really there? Are you watching Secession? And I'm talking to your representation.
That's the question that we'll increasingly be asking. Is it really a human being? Now, 2-3 years ago, it was very easy to tell that if you read a text, it's obvious to you if this text was written by a human being or by a computer, because there was a certain level of sophistication and coherence that machines were simply incapable of. Today, I think everybody had the experience in the last few weeks or last 2 or 3 months to read a text by, say, ChatGPT and say, this is it. I'm no longer capable of being sure whether texts are generated by a human or by an AI. Today, I think there was this big headline about a prize in photography given to an image which people thought was taken by a human being, but it was actually generated by an AI.
Ooh, wow.
And this will increasingly happen with conversations. It's one thing to create a text. It's another thing to have an ongoing interactive conversation. Add to that video and sound, how to mimic the body language, the facial expressions, the tone of voice. This is even more complicated, but we are getting there. So we are very close to the point when you are now having this conversation with me, and you cannot be absolutely sure that you are not actually talking with an AI. And previously in history, if you wanted to do a propaganda campaign or an influence campaign and talk with people, so you had, like before elections, you would send volunteers to knock on doors and try to have conversations with people. It was so expensive because you need so many volunteers. And it's inefficient because you have a conversation of, say, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It's not an intimate relationship. But think about the possibility that with the new technology, you can mass produce intimate relationships with millions of people. Like you had these bot farms, bot armies. So now the bot armies can also mass produce intimacy. And this is, we've never seen anything like it in history. And it's especially dangerous for democracies, because democracy, in the end, is a conversation. That's what it is. It's lots of people having a conversation about, the big issues of the day, how to deal with climate change, what to do about abortion, what to do about gun control. So we have a conversation. Once AI hacks human language, it can basically break down the conversation. What happens if you spend hours talking with somebody you think is a human being, but it's actually an AI? The conversation breaks down. Now, for autocratic regimes, this is good news. But for democracies, this is an existential danger.
This is like the political version of that Joaquin Phoenix movie, Her, where I think Scarlett Johansson is an AI and he falls in love with her and she's like, I think towards the end, spoiler alert here, he says, how many people are you talking to? And she's like, 14,500,783. And he's like, oh, and it just breaks him, right? Because he realizes that he's just like not even a number on a spreadsheet at that point. Hey, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There's a lot more just like this. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the show. What other new technology trends worry you? Maybe what, like genetic engineering, for example?
It is worrying, but it's developing on a much slower time scale, slower pace. Because anything that has to do with biology, it moves far more slowly.
Sure.
Like if you now make a change to human DNA and you want to see the result, it takes years. Because, you know, giving birth to a baby and then they have to grow up, and it takes decades for just one iteration of trying to change people through genetic engineering. Anything that has to do with the world of information and culture, it's far, far faster. So I do think that biotechnology also has a lot of both positive and negative potential to completely change history, but I'm not sure if we have the time. When AI is going to completely change the course of history within the next, I don't know, 10 years. Genetic engineering, it will take decades or even centuries, so we probably just don't have the time.
Right. It's like the least of our concerns is something that's going to happen in 200 years if we, in the next 20 years, are going to have a completely different artificial intelligence landscape.
One danger that we should take into consideration is, of course, genetic engineering, not of humans, but, you know, viruses or pathogens or things like that, that today you can basically print, you can just write code, and even AI can write a code for a new virus, print it out, and you have a new epidemic. So these are things that we should be concerned about. But with regard to changing humanity itself, I think that information technology is just moving much, much faster than biotechnology.
It seems like the thing that worries me, and again, maybe I don't need to be worried about that anymore. The thing that I guess scares me about genetic engineering is if you change the human genome to get rid of something, you can't just maybe get it back very easily. And I'm speaking as a layman here, so maybe I'm way, way off. But I think, what if we engineer everybody to be super, super intelligent, but somehow that lowers empathy?
It's very likely.
How do we get the empathy back? We don't, maybe.
We don't.
Ever.
That's very, very dangerous, because even we don't understand ourselves very well. We don't understand our body, how it functions, our brain, our DNA. It's extremely complicated. And like you just said, I mean, most traits, they are not the result of a single gene. They are the result of a combination of many genes and many processes in the body, which have a lot of other effects. So it's extremely likely that if we try to intentionally kind of re-engineer ourselves to be more intelligent, even if we succeed, there will be a lot of unintended consequences, like loss of empathy, which could be terrible. So this is why I think it's also extremely dangerous to allow these kinds of technologies or powers to narrow-minded organizations like, I don't know, armies and corporations, which, you know, armies would like to have more disciplined and intelligent soldiers, even if it comes at the expense of making people less empathic or destroying human spirituality. So we have to be extremely careful about not allowing armies and corporations and governments to acquire these kinds of abilities. And, you know, you look back in history, you see all kinds of examples of how, you know, people always had visions to re-engineer humanity, and it usually ended badly. You know, to give just one example, in many ancient kingdoms and empires, kings and emperors, they're always afraid that their ministers or generals would depose them and replace them, establish a new dynasty. This was the biggest headache of every Chinese emperor and every caliph, was what if my own ministers or my own general would rebel and depose me and take the throne. So one solution that many of these autocrats found was to use biotechnology thousands of years ago to create a new kind of human. And this was castration. That you take the general or the minister or whatever, and you cut off a certain part of the male body, and problem solved. This person, maybe they can still rebel against me, but they can't establish their own dynasty. So you see in many ancient kingdoms and empires that eunuchs were used to man the bureaucratic administration and even some of the high-ranking positions in the army and navy. Like before Columbus, the greatest naval expedition in history, a Chinese expedition, which reached all the way to Africa, was led by Admiral Zheng He, who was a eunuch. And again, from the viewpoint of the emperor, of the Chinese emperor, this is great, because this person is very unlikely to rebel against me and try to establish their own dynasty, because they can't establish a dynasty. Of course, from the viewpoint of the individual in questions, it was not such a great idea. But yeah, I mean, for centuries in a place like China, if you want a government job, they tell you, wonderful, you want a government job? Please, but we just need your testicles and the job is yours.
You might not make it through the interview process, though, unfortunately, with the medical technology of the day.
Yes.
Yeah, yikes. You know, but still better, maybe still better than starving to death on the streets of Beijing or whatever back in ancient China. You said something on 60 Minutes that really freaked out our boy Anderson Cooper. Something along the lines of, within a century or two, the Earth will be populated by beings as different from us as we are from chimpanzees. And that's a hell of an assertion, Yuval.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? What's happening with society in 200 years?
Yeah, well, again, it's more about technology than about society. The combination of biotechnology on one side and artificial intelligence on the other side means that if we don't destroy ourselves in the next century or two, we are very, very likely to use these technologies to either change ourselves, our own bodies and brains and minds, to such an extent that, again, we are more different, or these future entities will be more different from us than we are different from Neanderthals. You know, the only difference between us and Neanderthals is just a few genetic mutations, which led to changes in brain structure and a hormonal system and so forth. So we now acquire the technology, maybe not in the next 10 years, but in the next 100 years, of making even bigger changes intentionally to our DNA, to our bodies, to our brains. And in addition, we have the breakthrough in AI, which could lead either to combinations of organic bodies with computers, which are known as cyborgs, or to the creation of completely inorganic entities, completely inorganic beings that could be far more intelligent and capable than us. And, you know, it's difficult even to imagine what these beings would be like, because our own imagination is the product of organic biochemistry. It's the product of our own organic brain. And it's very difficult for us to even imagine what an inorganic entity, an inorganic being, would look like or would be capable of doing. You know, as organic creatures, for instance, we are used to the situation that you are always in one place in space, and all the parts of your body must be connected together for you to be alive. So I'm now in Tel Aviv. I can't be at the same time in Chicago or in Sydney. But this is just organic beings. If you're talking about an inorganic entity or a cyborg, these limitations collapse. And an algorithm or an AI entity, it can be in many places at the same time. And a cyborg could also be spread over space. So if your brain, and this is experiments that has already been done, you can today connect a bionic hand to a brain of a human, and you control the hand with just your brain. But the hand doesn't need to be attached to your body. You can control the hand by remote control, even if it's in another room or another city or another continent. So even these very fundamental things, like being in one place at one time, which we think this is obvious, life forms obey these laws, this may not apply to the future entities which might control the planet in a century or two.
And it makes sense for humans to build this kind of thing, because I'm thinking of a medical application, right? If I have brain cancer, God forbid, right? Knock on wood. And the best surgeon for that is in Israel. And maybe I can't travel. Maybe I just don't even need to. I go to the hospital in New York or somewhere in LA, and the guy in Israel cracks his knuckles before planning to go to watch the next Secession season 500 episode. And he just gives me the brain surgery from whatever tech deck he's using, and doesn't even need to wash his hands because he's, whatever, he's touching the same gloves he uses every day. Yeah. I get life-saving surgery, and he, at the end, goes and gets a massage and watches some TV or whatever the equivalent is in 50 or 100 years. And it's just routine. And I just got the best surgery of my life from a human, or if maybe we don't even need humans at that point to do that kind of thing. But just the idea that we could get medical care or connect with somebody at that distance is really, really something incredible. People could design really dangerous things without getting anywhere near them. Yeah. It would be really incredible. So, of course, humans will build this, even if it ends up being our own undoing. Nita Farahani, episode 810 of this show, she was concerned that AI-enabled humans essentially will widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots to a degree that humanity has never seen. And I think, imagine you can afford to get an AI-enabled brain implant for your kids. I can do the same, but other people can't. Where I grew up near in Detroit, the difference in capabilities would probably be like an office worker who has a computer with internet versus an office worker who doesn't have lights or electricity, or it could even be a greater gap than that.
Yeah, I think that we are getting close to a point in history when it will be more and more likely that economic differences will get translated into real biological differences, which previously in history was true to some extent. Like the rich had better food, so they grew taller then, and they had other advantages, but basically they were still the same human beings. But the danger one of the dangers we are facing now with the new technology is that if we don't make sure that everybody benefits, then we might see the greatest inequality ever emerging because of these new technologies. This is certainly a very, very big danger.
Algorithms being able to tell our sexual orientation. This was something you mentioned. I can't remember where. I think it might have also been on 60 Minutes, but it's like at first, when you're talking about this, it sounds like a fun party game, and then you realize that it's going to end up with a bunch of people getting murdered by an authoritarian government. Take us through this, because I think a lot of things with algorithms start with, this is going to be so convenient, and they end with, wow, I did not see that coming.
Yeah, I mean, I think about my own life. So I came out as gay when I was only 21. And I often think about my life when I was, 14 or 15. Now, it should have been obvious to me when I was 15 that I was gay, because looking back, I was far more interested in guys than in girls, even back then. But I didn't realize it. I grew up in a very homophobic society, so you had a lot of kind of self-repression. And even though the signs are there, you repress them. You don't know. And this is something very, very human. There are many things we don't know about ourselves. Sometimes we don't know about ourselves the most important things in life. But an algorithm could have told me, or could have discovered without telling me, that I was gay when I was 15 very easily. There are so many ways to do it. One way, which is today technically possible, is simply by tracking eye movements. That, I'm walking down the beach, and there is a sexy guy and a sexy girl. Where do my eyes go? And where do they linger? This is something which is, usually it's not even under your control. And today, a computer can track your eye movements and can know this even before you know it about yourself. So, in some scenarios, it could be used in a good way. to help people understand themselves and come to terms with themselves and so forth. But there are also quite disturbing usages for this kind of technology. One thing, for instance, is corporations using it to manipulate us. So for instance, I don't know, like Coca-Cola discovering when I'm 15 that I'm gay before I know it about myself, and deciding which commercials to show me. Like they'll show me the commercial with the sexy guy and not with the sexy girl. But there are much, of course, worse scenarios, like Uganda recently legislated a law which inflicts the death penalty on homosexuality. So what would the Ugandan government or the Iranian government or the Russian government do with algorithms that are able to detect people's sexual orientation? This is a frightening scenario, which could become real quite quickly. And I think more broadly, what we are looking at is the possibility of building the worst totalitarian regimes in human history. Because if you look at the 20th century, at regimes like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, they wanted to know everything about their citizens. They wanted to follow everybody all the time, but they couldn't, because the technology was not there. You know, in the Soviet Union, you have 200 million citizens, more or less. You don't have 200 million KGB agents that can follow each and every person 24 hours a day. And even if you do, you know, in the days of Stalin or Brezhnev, so a KGB agent that follows you, at the end of the day, writes a paper report about everything that you did and said and everybody you met and whatever. And then they send this paper report to Moscow. And every day, imagine that KGB headquarters gets 200 million paper reports. Nobody is able to read it and analyze it. Now, it is becoming possible. You don't need human agents to follow people around. You have all these cameras and microphones and so forth. And you don't need human analysts to make sense of the data. You have AI. So the new totalitarian regimes of the 21st century, they could be much worse than the Soviet Union. They can actually follow everybody all the time. And for instance, discover things about you that you don't know about yourself, like your sexual orientation when you're a teenager.
It is terrifying. I think of North Korea, and imagine if every time you have to say a poem about Kim Il-sung or whatever, or every time you look at the photos that are up everywhere, the giant paintings, there's some people who are going to go, wow, I'm so reverent for our dear leader. And other people are going to be like, oh, this freaking crap again. And if they can find out the people that are thinking, oh, this freaking crap again, they can throw them into re-education before that person even knows that they're sick of revering dear leader. Or just get rid of them, which is even more terrifying. But either way, you end up with totalitarian control. And you're right, it is really terrifying, especially because often it comes in the form of a game you play with your friends at a party on Facebook that says, all right, everybody look at the camera, and it's going to flash some pictures, and then we're going to find out if you're gay. And everyone's like, yay, that's going to be hilarious. And then it's not at all, right? It's terrifying. Because you found out you were gay from Facebook, even though you didn't know already, which would be really not a place I'd want to find that out. It's someone's birthday party.
Exactly. It's a very important moment in life. It's an important process, usually, not a single moment. And you need to do it in the right way. And
So, Mark Zuckerberg telling me via a meme on my Facebook wall is definitely not the right way.
No.
Reading some of your books, it looks like most of human history was essentially one war or conflict after another, hot or cold, and that peace was kind of just the absence of war. And it really seems like Putin's invasion of Ukraine has shattered that illusion, at least for my generation, where it's like, oh, the Cold War's over. Look at our lives. They're going to be so sunny and bright. It just reminded us that the barbarians really are just outside the castle walls. The jungle is still right outside. And aside from increased defense spending and maybe lower spending on everything else as a result, what do you think the macro effect of this is going to be?
You know, the macro effect is that we have all these existential threats we need to deal with as humanity. It's the technological threat we've just been discussing at length, the rise of AI and biotechnology and all the implications. And we have the ecological threat. And instead of uniting to deal with these threats together, we are just creating another existential danger of the Third World War that seemed like an almost impossible scenario, say 10 years ago, but now is increasingly looking like a very likely eventuality. Mm-hmm. And we are not going to, even if we don't have a hot world war, a third world war, if we don't unite to deal with AI on the one hand and the ecological crisis on the other, we can't solve these problems. Individual nations by themselves, they cannot stop climate change. We need some global agreement on it. And even more so with regard to regulating AI, countries that don't trust each other will not be able to regulate this disruptive technology. So we'll get into an arms race in AI, an arms race in biotechnology. And an arms race almost guarantees the worst outcome. Like every side, I don't know, you think about creating killer robots, weapons that are autonomous and can decide by themselves who to shoot and who to kill. This is obviously a very, very dangerous technology. Every country would say, we don't want to do it. It's obvious that this is a very dangerous step, but we cannot allow ourselves to remain behind. We can't trust the Russians, the Israelis, the Chinese, whoever, not to do it first, so we must do it before them. And the other side would say the same thing. And then you'll have an arms race. So it's going to develop first the most effective and lethal killer robots. And again, everybody knows it's a bad idea, and still everybody does it. That's the logic of an arms race. And the only way to stop it is through cooperation. But when you have Putin invading Ukraine, and it when again becomes a norm in the international system, that one country just tries to destroy its neighbors because it can, then trust collapses. And there is no way that we can stop the arms race or reach some agreement on regulating dangerous technologies.
So do you think that is essentially the war in Ukraine kind of a war for the norm that you can't just invade your neighbor? It seems like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's kind of like if we defeat Putin in Ukraine, then it says, hey, trust is more important here. You can't do that. Everybody who's thinking about doing that, don't do it, because we will unite and face you down. It's going to be the end of your regime, or you're just going to be in the meat grinder.
Yeah, I mean, for thousands of years, this was the human norm. Kind of humans lived in the jungle. For thousands of years, whether you live in ancient Greece or ancient China or medieval Europe or the 19th century, you know that at any moment, the neighboring tribe, the neighboring kingdom, the neighboring country might invade and conquer you. Everybody knows it. This is kind of the basics of history or the basics of international relations. And over the last few decades, it changed. It became unacceptable for one country to invade and annihilate a neighbor just because it can. We still had lots of wars, but of a different kind. You had a lot of civil wars, you had a lot of internal conflicts, but since 1945, there has not been a single case of an internationally recognized country which is just wiped off the map because a stronger neighbor invaded and conquered it. And this was reflected, for instance, in a decline in military budgets, because all countries felt much safer. And now this new norm is broken. And if Putin gets away with it, then it will return to the jungle, basically. Then countries all over the world will know that this is again possible. You know, it's like in a school when some bully beats up a child, a kid in the yard, And everybody is kind of forming a circle to see what happens. If the bully is stopped and punished, so you know, oh, you can't do these things. You can't behave like that. But if the bully gets away with it, then every kid in school knows that this is the new norm of the school. It can also happen to me. So I need to take care of myself. And taking care of myself in terms of international relations, for instance, means increasing your military budget or entering into military alliances, which of course impacts your neighbors. Because if you increase your military budget, they now feel less safe, so they increase their budget, and you have this arms race spiral again, which ultimately harms everybody.
Do you think we're likely to see an increase in the proliferation of nuclear weapons? I mean, a lot of people are saying, well, Ukraine gave up their nukes in exchange for security, and that didn't really work.
Absolutely. Again, if you live in the jungle, you want to have the biggest teeth. And certainly, when you think about the history of Ukraine, that after it gained its independence, it voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for these promises of protection, both from Russia and from the United States and the Western powers. And then it was invaded by Russia, and the Western powers said, okay, we are not going, we are helping you in many ways, but we are not sending our armies to help you. So all other countries in the world, again, are watching this. And the conclusion is, if we have nuclear weapons, don't give them up. No matter what guarantees you get, they won't be worth much in times of trouble. And it's in the countries that don't have nuclear weapons, at least some of them are likely to want to get some. And you know, if you think about even, I don't know, like the post-war arrangements after 1945. So both Germany and Japan, even though they had the ability to acquire nuclear weapons, they certainly have the technological and the economic resources necessary to produce nukes. They gave up this option, trusting in the United States to a large extent to provide them with a nuclear umbrella. Now, what happens, for instance, if in 2024 or 2028 a new US president is elected who opts for a very isolationist foreign policy, and basically Germany or Japan or other countries can no longer rely on the Americans to provide them with security? So even though at present it seems almost unthinkable that Germany or Japan would go nuclear, depending on, you know, the outcome of the next US elections, this can be a real development.
Yeah, that is scary, regardless of what you think about who's in charge of those nukes, right? Just proliferation in general is always, it should give everybody some pause.
Absolutely.
I've heard you say that if Putin waited 10 more years, maybe he might have gotten away with invading Ukraine because
the West would have collapsed. There
you go. Yeah. I was going to say, you didn't say the West would have collapsed, but there we go. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the culture war within the West, within the United States, within European countries, and the impression is if Putin and just left the West alone to go down with this culture war, he could have then done whatever he wanted. And I think that the biggest threat to the West, and to a large extent even to the peace of the world, is internal. Because the Western powers are still by far the most powerful bloc on the planet. You look both militarily and also culturally and economically. If Western democracies stand together, they are much more powerful than Russia. They're even significantly more powerful than China. You know, the Russian GDP is about the same as Italian GDP. In economic term, if you take Belgium and the Netherlands together, that's Russia.
Yeah. Wow.
But the West's biggest problem is internal, is this culture war, which is tearing the West apart. And, you know, this is extremely unfortunate because I think basically almost all sides in the culture war, they agree on the same basic values, on the same basic worldview. Looking from outside, it's really difficult to understand what the big fight is all about. Looking from outside, the difference, for instance, between Republicans and Democrats in the United States doesn't look very significant. They all agree on basic values like freedom, like democracy, like equality. If we talked earlier about humanism, for most of history, so people believed in the divine right of monarchs. And the big political battle in the 19th century, for instance, was between people who believed in the divine rights of kings to rule and the will of the people, democratic elections. This is no longer, Democrats and Republicans are in exactly the same camp. They both believe in democracy, in the will of the people. It's the same with the economy. They both believe in the free market. Yes, they have some, from a historical perspective, relatively small differences in the level of taxation they want. But it's not like in the early 20th century where you have a communist camp that wants to completely abolish private property. Nobody is talking in these extremist terms. So economically also, the difference between Democrats and Republicans is not so big. Even if you look at things like, gay marriage. So Republicans today hold much more liberal views than Democrats held 50 years ago.
Yeah, or 20 years ago. I think wasn't even Hillary Clinton was like, well, I don't know. And that was like 5 minutes ago in the historical timeline.
So it seems that people are taking certain flashpoint issues, which are important in themselves, of course, like abortion, like gun control, like transgender rights, and in a way, kind of weaponizing them and taking them to extreme in order to create this political polarization, which looked at from a broader perspective, that there just seems such a mismatch between the issues people are fighting over and what is at stake. Because what is at stake is really now the collapse of American democracy. What is at stake is the survival of the Western Bloc, maybe even the survival of humankind, because if we don't have unity in the world, then we won't be able to solve climate change and the threat of AI and so forth. And to risk all that because of arguments over who can go to which toilet, this seems just incredible. If we approach these hot topics not with an intention of weaponizing them, but with goodwill, all of them, people can reach compromises. Nobody would get everything they want, but they are all issues that people can actually compromise on because they are not, the most fundamental issues for the survival of the community or of the country.
I love hearing that because one of my deep questions here, or one of my primary questions here was, I don't understand why instead of seeing the tension between left and right as something necessary to democracy, keeping one another in check, having different ideas coexisting in one place, that used to be healthy. And now we're seeing people with different views as the enemy. Yeah. And I wondered if that was normal through history, because the differences in ideology don't seem greater now than they did in the past.
They seem
maybe
smaller.
Seem that way.
No, actually, if you think about the 60s, so the big arguments in the 60s about civil rights, about the sexual revolution, about the Cold War, the Vietnam War, they're much bigger in many ways or much more consequential than what people are arguing about right now. And you had a lot more violence also in the 60s, with assassinations of political leaders, with riots in the streets. And nevertheless, people, for instance, did accept the results of elections. The type of breakdown of the democratic institutions and traditions that we see today is, in this sense, even more surprising. And what is true is that when people start seeing their political rivals as enemies, democracy cannot be maintained. One of the things about democracy from a historical perspective is that it's not always possible to have democracy. democracy needs some quite rare preconditions in order to exist. Dictatorships you can have at any moment. You don't need preconditions. You can always have dictatorships. But democracy needs some preconditions. One of them is that people don't see their political rivals as enemies. You can think that they are stupid, you can think that they are misguided, you can think that they support the wrong policies, but they are not your enemies. They are not out there to destroy you and your way of life. If you start thinking that they are your enemies, that they want to harm you, then you will do anything to win the elections. And if you lose, you have no reason to accept the result, because this is a war. And we need to find a way, both in the USA, also in my country of Israel, also in other democracies, to kind of go back to a situation when we, again, you can think whatever you want about your political rivals, but don't see them as enemies. Because if that happens, you can have a civil war, you can have a dictatorship, or you can split the country, but you can't have a democracy.
That's terrifying if dictatorship or authoritarianism is almost the default, as long as we're not swimming upstream towards democracy, we're sliding back into one of those. Yeah. That's a terrifying historical perspective, because what that says is the second we sort of take our foot off the gas pedal, back we slide.
Yeah, because again, dictatorship is very easy and democracy is very hard, because democracy is built on trust between people and trust between people and institutions. You need to trust your neighbors. You need to trust other members of the community. You need to trust a lot of institutions in order for democracy to function. Dictatorship, on the other hand, it functions on the basis of distrust. For a dictator, it's a good thing that people don't trust each other, that people don't trust what they hear on the news, that people don't trust the courts. Because if people lack trust, they cannot unite against the dictator. It's the most basic, the most ancient trick is divide and rule. When people don't trust each other, that's the ideal situation for a dictator. When people trust each other, they can oppose the dictator, and this is the basis for a democratic system. But of course, trust is much, much harder to achieve than distrust. It takes years to build trust between people, and you can destroy this trust within a few days or even a few hours.
That's a scary thought, but do you have hope for the future in terms of trust, in terms of the West or the United States, or rebuilding this in the next 3 minutes that we have here?
Yes, I have hope, because the good thing about democracy is that it is much better than dictatorships at learning from its own mistakes and at trying something different. In a dictatorship, when a dictator makes a mistake or does something wrong, he's not going to admit it. There is no independent media that can expose it. There are no elections that you can replace him. Usually the dictator will just use his power to blame the problem on somebody else, on some enemy, some traitor, and demand even more power for himself. So what you see over time is that dictatorships tend to amplify their own mistakes, to repeat them and amplify them. In a democracy, on the other hand, there are self-correcting mechanisms that allow for identifying and rectifying the mistake. You have independent media. Even if the president does something terrible, the media can expose it. The court can oppose it. And people can replace them in the next elections. So over time, even though in the short term, it seems that dictatorships are much more efficient because they are ruthless, they can work fast, you just need one person to make a decision and the country changes its direction. In the long term, democracies are much better at learning from mistakes and changing course of action, which is why over time they perform better. Whether it will happen again in this round, I don't know. But the kind of doom scenario, the end of democracy, we have kind of accompanied the history of democracy for the last 200 years. Like you have these repeated crises when you think that this is it, democracy is over. And like happened in the 1960s. That in the 1960s, you see the Western democracies within a very deep internal crisis, whereas the totalitarian regimes in places like the Soviet Union, they seemed completely stable, that they will last forever. But in the end, it was the USSR that collapsed because it couldn't correct its own mistakes and adapt to new situations. Whereas Western democracies like the USA, they changed themselves. It was very difficult, but they succeeded in doing it, and this is how they eventually won the Cold War.
That's a very hopeful scenario. Let's hope when on this round of the dice roll, we come out on top. And I know we're out of time. It's so great to finally make this happen. Would love to do it again, depending on how painful this conversation was for you, of course.
No, it was very, very pleasant. Thank you.
And as our people are fond of saying, next year or next time in Jerusalem or maybe just Tel Aviv. But thank you very much. And I hope you enjoy the next episode of Succession.
Thank you.
Thanks for checking out this entire episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show. If you're interested in exploring this topic further, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There, we dive even deeper on this and many other topics. In the audio podcast, I also close open loops, cover things discussed off camera, off air, and give some parting lessons from our guest. You can find The Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any podcast app, or at jordanharbinger.com. And also, if you found this episode useful, please share it with those you care about. Last but not least, like, comment, and subscribe.